I heard that dreaded line for the first time in about 20 years. If you don't vote, you don't get to complain for the next 4 years. Oh, shut up.
There is nothing in the world that can stop me complaining. If anything you need to know about me, it's that I will complain regardless.
Who would have thought, though, that it wouldn't be Starmer that got in? Who would have thought it would be the Reform Party that actually won the election? I didn't see that.
And with Lib Dems as the second party.
Hello and welcome to Bread and Rosaries, the leftist Christian podcast that is very excited to record this episode for the first time. I'm Ben Molyneux-Hetherington. I'm joined by Adam Spears. Hello, Adam.
Hello again.
And we're also joined this week by Graham Jones. Graham, lovely to be on a video call with you for the very first time.
Lovely to be here as well.
Wow, thank goodness we're such a slick podcast.
Yeah, no one would ever know. To be fair, at this point, I think people just assume that, like, at least something goes wrong in every episode.
So whose fault was it this time, Ben?
Do you know what? Actually, it was my fault, which is not always the case. But in this situation, it was definitely 100% my fault. So I take full responsibility for the many failings of this podcast.
That's good, because if you're taking full responsibility for the many failings of this podcast, that means I don't have to take any responsibility for any failings.
Just to be really clear, I mean that exclusively in a moral sense and not a legal one. There is. Graham, you are not, if people were worried, the former Labour MP with terrible politics.
You're not, are you? You're not. You would have that confirmed.
I can confirm.
Graham, we're going to talk a bit about your book today, which we will get onto a little bit, but I heartily recommend. It's called Red Enlightenment, available at all good leftist booksellers. But I wanted to pick up on something you mentioned in the book that is completely unrelated to anything else we're going to talk about. But I'm just curious. You mentioned being in a weird rock band in the book. And now I have to ask you, what sort of weird rock band were you in?
I was in a bunch of different weird rock bands. Some were like pure sort of like noise music. Some were like kind of like had a sort of free jazz element. Others were more kind of like a sort of a instrumental post-rock kind of big crescendos, ethereal kind of guitar music. Yeah, there was we played around with lots of different things, toured around a little bit, and yeah, I don't do it anymore for some reason, but I always kind of threaten to start playing again at some point. If I can find some time to connect a few effects pedals together and make nice walls of noise again.
That is very cool. I think we're appreciative of this. Adam and I have both dabbled in musicians, but unfortunately, due to our history, the majority of our musical experience has been in Christian music, which is way less cool than.
Don't tell everyone that. I told you, man.
This is a historical experience. I hasten to add. Mine mostly dates to my teens.
Yeah, mine's a bit more recent than that. Sadly, I'm not now, but I was until relatively recently training for ordained ministry, and I did get roped into the band for occasional services. I did tell them that if we played any Hillsong, I reserved the right to complain loudly and constantly about it. So
I did actually. We played in some less weird rock bands as well, and sort of had like these sort of like Sufjan Stevens-esque kind of folk rock band as well, and I was a singer sometimes, and yeah, just sort of just trying everything really. It's a strange thing. I think this might be a sort of an autistic hyper-focus thing, because there used to be like absolutely everything I did was just music, and that's all I thought about and all I did. And now it's just nothing at all. Like my focus is completely shifted onto a completely different thing, and that's all going on that. So yeah, maybe one day it will just suddenly I'll wake up and it'll crash back into music. So we'll see.
And that's, of course, not an experience that Adam and I would have any personal knowledge of at all. Like, no.
No.
Neither of us have ever had that weird sudden hyper-focus that then disappears after a year.
A year?
A year, yeah. I've now got the self-control to kind of go, I need to know if in 2 months' time I still really want this stuff or if I found a new thing, which has been a big step forward, at least my bank account.
You are autisming at a very advanced level there. I'm very impressed.
So, we're going to talk a little bit about the book. But before we do that, we're going to start, as always, with what else is on my mind grapes.
What else is on my mind grapes?
And sadly, like a lot of people, on I think all of our mind grapes, no matter how hard we try, is the recent general election in the UK.
Wait, what?
Yeah, no, you don't, Adam, because I said I didn't want to ever talk about it, but you insisted we should probably mention it at some point. So,
did I really?
Yeah, you said you were going to make me talk about it, even though I don't want to.
Okay, well, I don't remember that. I don't remember that at all.
So I'm sure you all know what happened. I'm going to try. We've discussed this before as leftists that positivity is not a good thing, but I'll start, and I want each of us to say one enjoyable thing that happened on election night. We did not, unfortunately, win any sort of socialist revolution, but there were a few bright spots. I'm going to start with, for me, and this is very personal, Liz Truss losing her seat, which no matter who's replaced her, and I, as someone who has met said person, I will keep my opinions to myself. But having lived in Liz Truss's seat, having had a couple of email communications with her, which were like banging your head against the wall in terms of trying to help her understand basic concepts, watching Liz Truss look like she was pretty blissed out, shall we say. The face of someone who never has to go to Southwest Norfolk ever again in her life. But still, people are going, oh, it might have been more fun if she looked a bit more shocked. The fact that she went in, resigned, and still had to stand there knowing that she was going to lose was, I think, a real joy for me. And whatever comes next, and, I'm trying to be positive, so we won't dwell on that too much. On a purely personal level, seeing Liz Truss fall and what was for a very long time, when I lived there, the talk was it was pin a blue rosette on a donkey part of the world. Watching Liz Truss lose was my personal highlight for the election.
I had a similar one in that I enjoyed watching Jacob Rees-Mogg lose his seat while standing next to the baked beans man. Now, I kind of generally find those joke candidates a bit kind of cringe and rubbish, but I do enjoy the fact that it increases the humiliation factor of the whole spectacle for these career politicians to lose their seats while surrounded by this kind of theatre. So, on balance, I'm totally in favour.
I think Rees-Mogg is particularly there's something about undercutting his kind of desperate attempts to look kind of important and, all the rest of it is particularly funny in that case, isn't it? That he having to even have known of the existence of baked beans is below Jacob Rees-Mogg's station, never mind the rest of it. So, yes. What you got, Adam?
I find it very, very hard to
be positive. That's what you find it hard to do
whatsoever. Yeah.
This is not the first time I've made everyone go around and say something positive about something, and you have failed to come up with anything.
Look, I suppose. Okay, so I'm originally from Folkestone. I haven't lived there for a long time, but the Folkestone and Hythe constituency has been a conservative stronghold since it was founded in 1950. It was Michael Howard's former seat, so that shows you, how Tory it is. I suppose, I can just about muster enough enthusiasm, even though it was a Labour Party candidate who took the seat this time. I'm glad that the Tories are out, and I'm glad that the Tories are out in the country as a whole. I think what I will say, though, is that I'm more glad of the 71 votes won by the Socialist Party of Great Britain candidate, Andy Thomas. So there we go.
Yeah, and I think we can. I think people could probably predict word for word what we have to say about the rest of the election, about our new government, and all the rest of it. But an attempt at some vague positivity there from us, and there was some good stuff around. We have our critiques of the Green Party, but actually to have four of them, suggests that both climate politics and politics. Kind of somewhat of the left, I think the Greens slightly complicated in their politics,
Ish.
but
Yeah.
or slightly conflicted almost in their politics. But actually, the impression I get is that their voter base was people who care about the climate and people who are more keen on left politics. So there is, alongside the bad stuff, there are bits that suggest that there is not. We're not ready to give up hope entirely yet. Give it 6 months of Keir Starmer, and we'll get back to you on that.
I mean, yes, I agree with that, and I'm saying this as someone who I was a member of the Green Party for about 5 years, and I ended up becoming somewhat to the left of the Greens, so I'm no longer a member of the Green Party. But one of the things that I think it's really important to recognise is that the Greens have, they have dealt with some of this, but they still have, much like the other parties, a transphobia problem in the party. And that was really brought home for me recently when one of their co-leaders said something that I think he was trying to pander to the transphobes, and I can't remember exactly what it was he ended up saying, but he was playing into the hands of transphobes, I think, trying to court votes from them, and that made it very difficult for me to go into the booth and put a cross next to the Greens, which I did eventually. But yeah, when we talk about the fact that there are problems with them, I think it's important to recognise just how deep some of these problems are.
Jesus weeps for Gaza. He sees the pain and suffering of the 1.9 million people who have been forced to leave their homes without access to nutritious food, clean water, decent shelter. He hears the cries of the 25,000 orphaned children. He is with all who mourn the 250 people killed every single day. Christians for Palestine UK is a group of Christians who are calling for an immediate ceasefire in Palestine. We don't pretend to have all the answers, but are united in our prayers, hope and action for equality, peace and justice for all the peoples of the Holy Land. Together, we are organising a Christian presence at the National Marches for Palestine and local days of action, where we've been joined by siblings from Sabeel Kairos, Pax Christi, and a whole range of Christian churches. We urge you to join us to act in solidarity with the people of Palestine and call for a permanent ceasefire and just peace. The Very Reverend Canon Richard Sewell, Dean of St. George's College in Jerusalem, says, "I warmly welcome the newly formed group, Christians for Palestine UK. Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank need to see the solidarity of Christians in the UK, and they will be encouraged to see your commitment to stand up for them in their time of terrible suffering." To find details of local actions or to join the Christian bloc at a national march, follow Christians for Palestine UK on Instagram and Facebook, or email christiansforpalestineuk@gmail.com. Join us as we call for a ceasefire now.
Yeah, it's weird because so many of the parties seem to be doing, whether like systematically or just individual members doing things to try and sort of maybe not appease, but like appeal to transphobes. But I think that's very much a case of sort of discourse kind of feeding on itself. Like I really don't think, and I think there's lots of polls that say that most people don't care, that it's just not an issue. And I noticed one of the things I could have mentioned as a little happy note is all of the the transphobic candidates, like the explicit like transphobe parties that just totally failed, like the silent majority kind of people getting 200 votes. Was it Posey Parker or whoever lost a deposit? And that's always a good sign. But then you might argue, well, it's because the mainstream parties were making those arguments anyway, so why would you need to vote for independence? But I just don't think it was anywhere near a big enough issue for most people for it to even have been worth them making these horrible arguments. It's literally done nothing except for just shit on a group of people. So, I mean, fingers crossed it will eventually just fall out of the discourse. But I mean, I don't know. It doesn't. It's not promising, is it?
No, I mean, and the thing is that politicians, especially elected politicians with a national platform, do to some extent shape the narrative as well. It's not that they're just reacting to what people are thinking, and I think people's views, something becomes the obvious one is around immigration. We didn't hear for a few years a whole lot about immigration, and then when the Tories took their lurch to the right, suddenly immigration was a really important thing again, and everyone was rabid about it. And I think this is the thing, that when politicians decide to scapegoat a group of people, a lot of people will go along with that. Even people who claim to find politicians and whichever party odious and awful, the narrative is still shaped by those people, and so people go along with it.
Yeah, and I think, actually, we'll have to point the finger at the media there as well, in terms of, I think there is a natural affinity for certain forms of transphobia within the media. There is the fact that it's an appealing kind of media story in terms of it being kind of, attention grabbing. You can point the finger at outsiders. And also the transphobes are quite effective media kind of manipulators. They're very good at getting headlines and stories and front pages, right? And I think that then feeds into politics, and there's a bit of a feedback loop there, where politicians feel the need to address things because, well, it's all over the newspapers. And as you say, most people don't give a shit. They're either kind of mildly transphobic or mildly trans-affirming, but don't have massively strong kind of opinions, wouldn't base their votes on it. But then you have a Labour Party in particular that went out of its way to try and appeal to an anti-trans rhetoric, went back on things that it said previously. And I think that is about, that kind of media discourse, the way that's been shaped by transphobia and the way that kind of feeds into political discourse. So, Adam, you had something else on your mind, Grapes, that you wanted to throw into the mix as well.
Yeah, because I've sort of screwed up your let's all be positive about the election thing, I thought I'd give us a story that's a bit funnier. So there is a game that came out last year called Cities Skylines 2, which is a sort of big city builder game. And it's had all sorts of problems. But one of the problems it's had is that the rent is too damn high, and so basically you would end up with the same kinds of problems happening in this game that you have genuinely happening in real life for a lot of us, and a lot of the issues just really, they're really close to home, to be honest. And they end up with people not having anywhere to live and all that kind of thing in this game. And so they've come up with two solutions for this. One of them is that they just turn off the notifications and everyone just has to kind of deal with the rent being high. It's just that you as the player won't see that all these people can't afford to do anything in the game. The other option is that they killed off all the landlords. And I've got to be honest, I'll tell you which one I like.
It is a fascinating thing, though, actually, that a game cuts to the chase of, okay, actually, when you accurately sim reality, things go wrong very quickly when you have landlords.
And the solution to that is to just go full Mao. That's their solution. And I'm not a big fan of Mao, but I enjoyed this solution to it.
I don't even know if this is like an urban myth or whatever that I'm just propagating now, but it's in my head. The idea that Monopoly, it was intended as an anti-capitalist game. And the point is you get frustrated because like all of the wealth becomes accumulated by one person. And like this thing, which is just like a kind of an accepted part of this game, was actually the point. And it was like trying to make you hate capitalism. I think maybe we've underestimated the power of gaming for raising people's consciousness.
Yeah, Monopoly is actually really fascinating. I don't know if you know the history beyond that. So it was invented by a woman who was like a progressive Georgist. So she believed in a land value tax and that basically land should be collectively owned by everyone. But she invented this game, but she didn't put copyright on it or anything. And basically so it didn't look exactly like Monopoly, but it was basically nicked from her by these terrible corporate people who mass marketed the game. But yeah, the person who actually invented it, I don't think she ever made a penny out of it, which, is just so much about that game, though, that shows how bloody terrible capitalism is. Also, it's a terrible game.
Yeah, as I say, someone who does play a fair amount of board games, I do have to go out and say that that Monopoly is a bad game, and it might be proving that capitalism is bad, which fair enough, but it's still very annoying to have to play.
Yeah, especially with family members who actually, I hope she doesn't mind me saying this, but the last time I played Monopoly, it was some years ago now, it was an ex-girlfriend. And the problem when I play Monopoly is that even though I'm very much an anti-capitalist in real life, when I play Monopoly, I become very competitive and turn into just a kind of arch capitalist. And my partner who I was playing with cried because of how awful I was. So I'm sorry.
So today's main topic, we are going to talk about Graham's book, which Adam and I both read, and I really enjoyed. I thought it was a really interesting way of approaching some of the questions that we often talk about at the podcast, in terms of spirituality and faith, socialism, and integrating those things in a positive way that doesn't take both one or the other of them as kind of the dominant one. You get certain forms where it's like, we're first and foremost Marxists, and you can have a little spirituality on the side if you like, or we are Christians and we'll use a little bit of socialism to help out, but it's kind of not the main thing. I guess, Graham, if you could just give us a little bit of your background on what you're trying to do with this book, what the kind of big idea of this book was for you.
The book sort of started coming together when I was doing quite a lot of organising, whether it was around housing or mental health and sort of general sort of revolutionary organising, and various sort of problems I was coming up against in those organising spaces at the same time that I was sort of personally grappling with sort of how to harmonise the way that I sort of saw the world, or the way that I wanted to see the world and feel in the world, with my politics, and how the two were only ever spoken about in sort of separate terms. It was either one or the other, as you were talking about, and trying to sort of see them in a sort of more holistic kind of way. My sort of personal background is sort of a mix of, my parents were Catholic on the one hand and quite openly, explicitly atheist on the other. My my dad was very much having an argument with Jehovah's Witnesses on the doorstep kind of guy, but in a friendly way. He really enjoyed it and he was nice about it. He wasn't like an angry sort of new atheist kind. He sort of laughed about it. Whereas on my mum's side, it was, she's a Catholic. And so there was always this kind of like mix of having sort of a desire towards sort of spiritual practice, but also being kind of critical of it and also being sort of like drawn towards sort of more atheist kind of ways of approaching the world. My dad was also very much sort of like, he had kind of like a vague sort of like new age spirituality thing going on where he would like read little bits from various different traditions and go, oh, I like that bit. I like that bit. I like that bit. In the last few years of his life, I introduced him to Spinoza and he was like, oh, so actually there is someone who has the same beliefs as me. So a lot of that you can, if when you read the book, you can maybe see bits of my parents sort of like pleading into it. And obviously I explicitly talk about them as well. But yeah, that's sort of kind of where it came from in terms of these kind of conflicting desires, I think. And I went through sort of late teenagehood and early adulthood, having moved from being a sort of a child who was like a believer in the sense that I'd have conversations with God in my head, and I prayed, and I was the one kid in assembly who had his back straight and was singing in falsetto. Like, very sort of like, oh, I have to take this seriously, like, and then completely flipped and became very sort of like hardline atheist, no, religion is all nonsense, blah, blah, blah. And it was only sort of like in my kind of mid-20s onwards towards now when I was like finding a middle ground between the two, where I was sort of like, okay, like I am basing my personal kind of worldview off something approaching a kind of a scientific worldview, but how can I approach that in a way which makes me feel the same kind of awe at the world, at the universe that I have experienced through religion? And that's sort of how I've personally come to my kind of strange mishmash of worldviews and ideologies. And at the same time, of course, there was separately from that, there was then political radicalization as well, which at one point they were quite separate and they've become sort of melded together through time. And the book is a sort of a reflection of that. And it's basically trying to do a number of things. The two main strands of what it's trying to do is, on the one hand, trying to be a mediator, I guess, between sort of religious leftists and atheist leftists, particularly arguing in the direction of the atheists and saying, hey, maybe you could be a little bit less of a dick about religion, because there are lots of people that would be very, very useful to be able to actually like talk with and organize with, because we have shared problems, and there needn't be so many tensions between them. Also, just beyond talking about sort of religious and atheist leftists, just talking about people in general, the vast majority of the world is religious in some way. And if we want to solve global problems, we need to be able to organize and coordinate and show solidarity on a global scale. And that is, in my view, only hindered by being kind of reactively anti-religious. So even just from that purely strategic point of view, we need to get beyond this sort of baseline antagonism, which is not to say that there can't be debates like healthy conflict, but just to get rid of the final vestiges of this kind of really nasty, almost kind of undialectical conflict. It's just a complete shutdown and a refusal to accept any kind of complexity, any kind of fluidity, which a lot of atheist leftists still express. Although it has actually gotten quite a bit better over the last sort of 10 years. You do see more dialogue going on, more kind of openness. And I just want to sort of like contribute to that. That's the one sort of side of it. And then the other side is kind of speaking, I guess it is speaking probably more widely than this, but I want to be able to try and present something to people with more secular beliefs and say, hey, look, we can actually create a sort of a spirituality without it necessitating supernatural beliefs per se. And I just sort of like try to set out something that on the one hand would help sort of atheists, again, to kind of maybe have more empathy with people with spiritual beliefs, but also to create their own spiritual practice, which can be one of the things that I sort of find interesting is studies that talk about, and maybe I'm getting a bit too scientistic about this and a bit too positivist, but like, there are plenty of studies which show that spiritual practice is good for your mental health. it's good. It helps. It feels good. It feels
You
nice.
clearly haven't gone to the church I've gone to, have you?
Institutions is a different matter. Religion would be great if it wasn't for the people. But yeah, simply like, creating a practice can be brilliant for your mental health. You've gone about the right way, of course. And this can be really useful for sort of breaking out of these kind of like cycles of disempowerment, whereby, we look at the world, it's absolutely shit. We know it's shit and we know we need to change it. But because it's shit, it makes us feel shit and we can't do anything because we're so depressed. And so we get locked into this vicious cycle. And having things that, whether you want to call them spiritual practice or whether they sort of have the same impact as spiritual practice, that can be one way of breaking that cycle. And so we can have these sort of practical and strategic uses as well as sort of ethical and broadly what we might call spiritual uses.
I was going to ask you to talk a little bit about the title, because you've called it Red Enlightenment. And when I saw that, I assumed enlightenment was a reference to the kind of spiritual state of enlightenment, and it is, but you're also drawing quite heavily on that kind of enlightenment philosophy, tradition, whatever you want to call it. And I thought you charted a really interesting course around acknowledging and accepting some of those kind of post-colonial critiques, I guess you'd call them, whilst also saying there is still something worthwhile in Enlightenment thought to unpack and utilize, even if we need to kind of retool it in light of these critiques. Yeah,
so I guess the way that people tend to approach the Enlightenment is it feels a little bit too simplistic. It's whether it's someone's approaching it as a positive or as a negative, it's almost taken as though it's this single homogenous simple thing, rather than it having had its own kind of internal conflicts and different ways of approaching it. And what I sort of argue in the book, I'm not the first person to argue that we can sort of approach the Enlightenment in a different way, and sort of there were different strands of the Enlightenment. So I'm drawing on other people's arguments that have come before, and that there are strands of the Enlightenment that had a more sort of democratic, maybe sort of more liberal kind of inclination, and that in there you can find some of the seeds of later sort of leftist socialist thought, as well as the more explicitly kind of reactionary side of it. And yeah, one of the figures I think we wanted to talk about that exemplified this is Toussaint Louverture. My French pronunciation is terrible. I apologize. The leader of the Haitian slave revolution. And this is always for me is like one of those kind of like those examples is a really good one to jump to. I saw there was another book actually that came out recently. I think it might be on Verso. I can't remember the exact name, but it was another one about this sort of idea of a radical enlightenment. And some of the immediate comments, people hadn't read it, but they were just reacting to the title. They were like, oh, the Enlightenment is a racist colonialist project. And the first thing, you can just respond with the name, Toussaint Louverture. And it's sort of like, how do you square the Enlightenment as a completely colonial project when the most successful slave revolution in history was led by someone who was explicitly pro-Enlightenment, was explicitly drawing from Enlightenment thinkers, as well as also being a Catholic, which is another thing. I sort of like tie it into the religious element in the book. There was the whole element of the slave rebellion itself. People were practicing voodoo at the time, and so there's this whole kind of like mix of different things going on. And it's just a perfect kind of sort of linchpin of all these different ideas of where sort of spiritual practice, sort of intellectual enlightenment, and sort of liberatory politics can be shown to, like, it's possible for them to work together. And I think that's mainly that's one of the main reasons why I was interested in including that in the book is to just show the possibility and to sort of spark the idea that we can create that kind of crossover again, that we can find moments where this happens. And there are a couple of different examples through history where it happens, but there may not be a sort of a single kind of, this idea of a red enlightenment. It's not like I'm necessarily arguing that there's this unbroken tradition, but more that there's sparks where you see it working, and that there's always this potential for us to do it again.
Absolutely. And I think that's a really good way to lead us into our Saint of the Week.
Saint of the Week.
Our saint of the week this week is Toussaint Louverture. I don't know if that's right. I'm not sure it is, but that is as close as I could approximate from a YouTube video I watched talking about him. Yes, as you kind of said, he's this. He's known as the father of Haiti, and obviously, was very influential in the slave rebellion. He's still quite influential. He was very influential on John Brown, and was kind of cited often amongst African American slaves as the kind of, this is the guy that you need to follow to get to freedom. And as you say, he was Catholic. When I was looking into a little bit, there's an interesting thing about, he was very Catholic, and he was known, even when he was still a slave before he was emancipated, he was known as one of the most Catholic slaves in the plantation, and he was would try and go to mass every day. He was often the godfather at kind of slave baptisms. He grew close to the churches that were kind of, I can't remember which church it is, but one of the churches actually gets thrown out of Haiti for treating the slaves too well and preaching to them like they're real human beings. And he was close to them and the subsequent kind of church organization that continued doing that kind of preaching. But he was also, there was elements of kind of that traditional voodoo religion that he still kind of adhered to. And obviously that's a very kind of Afro-Haitian population. That's a very important cultural and religious institution.
Can I just come in there quickly? I know this might be a really dickish thing to say, but there's a difference between voodoo and vodou.
Okay.
Vodou is the actual correct way of saying it. Voodoo is the thing that ended up in New Orleans. So what you're talking about is vodou.
That's fascinating. I did not know that. I just went, have I been spelling voodoo wrong this entire time when I read it? So vodou, it turns out. And in fact, he was in some places, and he went traveling, and he was seen as a doctor because of his use of kind of traditional vodou herbal medicine. So a very, very religious guy. Like all of our saints of the week, we like to complicate them a little bit. The word saint we use very much tongue-in-cheek. So very much not a perfect figure at all. So actually, despite that history with Vodou, he does outlaw it and kind of persecute it when it becomes the rule of Haiti. And he, had some complicated history around, he kind of ran his own plantation at one point, and so very much not a figure to kind of uncritically praise in all ways, but certainly someone really influential. And you can't knock someone who mounted a slave rebellion against the French and successfully booted them out of the island. And I think that's whatever his personal faults and kind of failings are, I think he's a really fascinating figure. And as you say, very much an Enlightenment figure in a way that complicates that picture of Enlightenment that can get painted.
Saint of the week.
Something I wanted to pick up from the book, Graham, was this idea that you introduced of ontological realism. Actually, in part because it kind of drives to the heart of a bit of a debate Adam and I have had historically about the question of kind of absolute truth. I have a bit more of a tendency towards postmodernism than Adam does. I think it's fair to say. Is that right, Adam, would you say?
I think when it comes down to it, we're probably in a relatively similar place, but I think I'm probably a little bit more critical of postmodernism as a movement than you are.
Yeah, I think probably that I just know less about it as well, so I'm just like, it seems all right.
You can't know much less than I do, so we need Johnny here, really, don't we? That's what we need.
So one of the other co-hosts, Johnny, is very much our resident postmodernism expert. But there's a quote, I'm not going to do it in full, but there's a quote that I thought was really interesting to kind of talk a little bit about. And you talk about the difference but compatibility of ontological realism and epistemological relativism. And you describe it as being committed to a real world that exists outside of human perception, but affirming that human meaning-making systems for understanding that reality differ between people, communities, cultures, and historical periods. And I thought that was a really helpful way of, I think, historical materialism and those ideas are really, I think, quite key to a kind of leftist project and really important, but also, recognizing that some of the claims to absolute truth are not always helpful. And, spirituality kind of exists in a place that is not as easily foldable into historical materialism. And I thought, that was a really interesting kind of approach to kind of say, actually, you've got these two, we can simultaneously have this ontological realism and recognize that kind of difference between people's perspectives and realities?
Yeah. So one of the ways of sort of trying to bridge them is by having what I sort of see as a materialist kind of understanding of meaning making itself, like how it emerges out of individual bodies and collectives of bodies, how we sort of pass ideas and around and how it reshapes our worldviews. Once you have that, you can, if you have your sort of ontological realism, you say, well, all of these bodies, all of these collectives, these are real things, and they out of that they are producing these sort of worldviews, and those worldviews can sometimes be quite separate from other ones that emerge in other areas. Then you can sort of find this way of like bridging those two things, that sort of that relativism of our worldviews, but the fact that there is a fairly consistent world beyond them that they emerge out of. It's almost like essential, I think, to what a lot of the contemporary left is trying to do, but it's often not able to articulate it, and people end up arguing for one over the other, even whilst they're actually assuming that both are true. Because I mean, it's very difficult to argue that there's any kind of like you're saying, historical materialism is necessary. If you're arguing there's any kind of regular patterns to capitalism, if capitalism is a thing that has any kind of global structure, well, then you're saying that there must be some sort of real world beyond each of our individual experiences and each of our communities' experiences. But then if you're talking about sort of, understanding people from different cultures and being able to sort of reach out to them and work together with them, if you're not accepting difference, then you're either inherently in conflict with them, or you're trying to trample over them and just sort of like try to replace their beliefs wholesale with yours in a sort of quite a sort of a domineering kind of way. And I think most people on the contemporary left wouldn't really accept either one of those in an absolute sense. And so I think it's quite essential that we find some way of harmonizing these two different ways of seeing things. And we were saying about, like, when you mentioned materialism and spirituality, I think there's a bit of a discussion in that in the book as well, because one thing that is a big issue for me, and it might not seem like a big issue because it's just a semantic one, but it often goes to how people are justifying excluding spirituality, is the term materialism is actually quite vague in how a lot of people use it. And it can have lots of different, senses. And I think I lay out sort of like 3 different ways of understanding the word materialism. And I think a lot of time people are conflating a sort of reductive physicalist kind of idea of matter and saying, well, that's materialism. When really, when we're talking about historical materialism, it's more about those kind of social and historical scale patterns of organization. It doesn't really have much to do with physical matter. There might be a sense of it's materialist in the sense we're talking about real bodies and real things and how people are really interacting. But it's almost a completely different scale and domain, and often those two things are completely conflated. And so I think there's more space in there if you start understanding historical materialism as talking about the patterns of social organization. We don't even really need to be talking about the physical level. Although in the book I do actually talk a lot about that sort of level. But then we get into a different critique in that a lot of the left's understanding of physical matter is still stuck in the 19th century. And there's been quite a lot of stuff that's happened since then, science-wise. I was about to do that thing where people go, well, I know Marx and Engels would have agreed with me, but I think it's probably fair to say that they were very much for being up on the science of their time and trying to integrate that into their thought and to critique it as well, but sort of to have a dialogue with that. And so it doesn't really make any sense to me if you're going to go beyond purely historical materialism and have this dialectical materialism where you want to talk about science and stuff like that, you really have to be able to in some way engage with the sciences of the 20th and the 21st century. You can't just parrot what Engels was saying in Dialectics of Nature. As good as it was for its time, you need to, that needs to be more of an engagement with what has come since. So yeah, that's a whole rant about my problem with how a lot of the left thinks about materialism.
Yeah, but I think you're absolutely right that actually, if you take those ideas of dialectics seriously, then you absolutely have to do new stuff, come up with new things, because dialectical forces will have moved things on since the time of Marx and Engels, right? Like, that's kind of baked in. That's not at all to dismiss their work, which I think is still extremely valuable in a lot of ways, but to recognise that within their work, they make it clear that things will not be static, right? That's one of the big things about capitalism, is it cannot be static. It always has to be moving. So things are going to change and move. That's kind of a fairly basic aspect of Marxist kind of ideas, isn't it? So, yeah, to say, well, they probably worked it out in the 19th century is not a helpful way of thinking at all.
That's a sort of a useful point for sort of demonstrating this difference between the epistemological relativism and ontological realism. It's not that matter itself has changed in 200 years, or physics is like the actual world itself physically has not changed in terms of its constituents, but our systems of understanding have moved on. They have developed. And so both of those are perfectly compatible. In fact, we need both of them to understand both of those things to have any sort of understanding of what science is actually doing. There are always human systems for understanding, even if we accept that there is a solid, consistent world that we are trying to understand with them. And it's the same when we're talking about, social forces. We can say there are real forces at play. Capitalism is doing particular things on a global scale, but our systems for understanding them are not. They're not. They are not that. They are always this sort of fallible human attempt to grapple with that, and they can develop, and they're still useful. It's not like saying, oh well, therefore there is no absolute truth beneath them. There's no point in trying to develop systems of thought because we can't ever grasp this sort of real world. Well, there's still a point in doing it. We can still sort of approach. We can still create systems which allow us to act in different ways, and through how the world reacts to our acts, then we can develop our systems of thought, in sort of conjunction with this world that we can never truly understand. There's still a purpose to developing those systems in both the sort of the socio-political and the scientific realm. We need to understand both that ontological and that epistemological side and how they're interacting.
And I think that really opens up space to understand how religion and spirituality works within that leftist context, right? Because you've got that ontological realism. And so, I can have atheist, Muslim, Jewish, whatever comrades, and we kind of are working towards the same ontological realism. We are trying to impact that real world in real ways, and we can work together on that, whilst also recognizing that just as me and another Christian might have very different view of the world, our experiences of the world or whatever come from different places, that's true of Muslim comrades, atheist comrades, etc. But that is a kind of a function of being individual people, that we all have our own kind of individual perspective, and that, yes, so obviously kind of reactionary religion, dangerous forms of religion that negatively impact the real world that exists are things we have to fight against, but forms of religion that are broadly healthy, broadly, I guess useful in some sense, absolutely can go hand in hand with that kind of leftist movement, because that's an expression of that kind of epistemological relativism, but we can also agree on the real world kind of as it exists and work to change it regardless of our different perspectives and worldviews.
Yeah, and it's like, because we're accepting on the one hand, this diversity of opinions, but we're still, we still want to have reference to a world beyond any of those opinions. If we don't have that, then there's very little to ground, why are we accepting some and not others? What is it about a reactionary opinion? Why do I care? If there's no world beyond just my worldview, if we're all just in these little silos, then what does it matter? Because what we need is a reference to, well, what impact do your worldviews have? What does it change in my world and the worlds of others? And to do that, we need to look beyond this sort of atomistic understanding of us all just having, just being a pure diversity, and we just have to accept a diversity. Well, no, I don't have to just accept Christo-fascists, because of the impact that they actually their views have. And so we can find solidarity with people beyond the kind of the differences in how we are understanding what is reality, or, based upon, well, do I accept the impacts of what you're saying and what you're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really helpful way of thinking about it.
I feel like this is a perfect time to advertise that you can get your Christians Against Christofascism t-shirt or sticker from the Bread and Rosaries shop, breadandrosaries.com/shop.
You're so much better at doing the promotion stuff than I am, Adam. You're on it always.
Yeah, it's my inner capitalist just comes out at certain points, yeah.
Kind of to round off our conversation, I want to talk a little bit about some of the kind more concrete practices you talk about in the book. I have to start with some of the stuff you talked about in terms of embodiment. You've got a really interesting kind of critique of art and drawing the similarities between biblical hermeneutics and how we engage with art, which I think is really kind of interesting, and particularly talking about grounding in a community, that kind of reading of art, in the same way we need to ground readings of scriptures in communities because there's multiple potential interpretations. But I was particularly interested in, you talk about a bit the importance of play, and you use this phrase, which I really like, which is regularized imaginary spaces. And you really enjoyably and provocatively use it to describe both kind of religious communities and religious services, and also the BDSM community, which I think is actually a really helpful comparison. Actually, it might upset. I think anyone who's going to be upset by that is not going to be listening to this podcast. So I think we're probably fine.
They wouldn't have got to chapter 7 or
But yeah, I'm really interested to hear you talk about those ideas of play and that kind of imaginative space, and I guess that use of art.
Yeah, I guess it kind of comes out of one of those sort of like perennial, probably unanswerable philosophical questions, is like, what is a game? More of an analytical question rather than, Marx wasn't asking this question. This is like Wittgenstein. And that sort of dovetailing with this question of what is ritual, because this is a very sort of a big and probably unanswerable anthropological question, because the joke is like, if an anthropologist doesn't know what they're looking at, it's like, oh, well, it was ritualistic practice. It's just it's such a vague kind of notion that it can be applied to basically anything. And yet at the same time, it's quite clearly central to what we understand sort of religion and spirituality to be. So what I guess I'm proposing in the book is like ritual. Think of it first of all not as an either or, but as sort of as relative sort of degrees of like how things are constrained, and things, like we're saying in BDSM play and other forms of play as well. You're creating a sort of a space in which the normal rules of social interaction are kind of suspended. And within that space, there are typically, there are rules, and there are often sort of like patterns of movement and various ways of constraining the activity that goes on in that space. And it's like it is creating a sort of almost like an imaginary world. And that's quite useful in like spiritual practice, in that it's in the one sense able to take you out of your body in terms of how your body is normally integrated into the world, whilst at the same time intensifying what's going on in your body, with the sort of the hyper focus on movement, in things like meditation, focus on the breath, or in prayer, kind of focus on thoughts, focus on where your body is, and just controlling movement. And yeah, so it's this sort of very powerful space for one and the same time stepping out of the world, but also intensifying your relationship with the world. And you might also frame that as, intensifying your relationship with God, and various different ways of sort of thinking about it. And in something like BDSM, it's interesting because, a lot of people who don't understand BDSM just sort of think, oh, it's like sex, but more violent. But actually how it's typically sort of done, when it's done responsibly, it is very much play. They'll talk about scenes, you begin and you end a scene, and when you're in that scene, it's like an imaginary space that has its own kind of rules, and you can opt out of that. You have safe words, which are like saying, okay, that's the pause button or the stop button, and you sort of you often like talk about beforehand what you want to do and what the limits are of what you want to do. And it's like creating a sort of game, or whether it's a game or a ritual where you're literally just doing sort of a sequence of events. has this same quality as a religious ritual of reducing the complexity of the world and creating this kind of imaginary space where things are both simplified and intensified. And it's really interesting, like you were saying, how there's that similarity, but obviously that huge conflict, because these are sort of like sides of social life that are usually seen as quite, opposed to one another. Unless, of course, if you're an occultist, the BDSM, obviously the two are very neatly kind of crossing over. But yeah, and also like in the sort of the scheme of the book, it was sort of like talking about this as a possible space for consciousness raising and changing consciousness, because by creating different types of ritual spaces, it's a place to play with how you see the world and how you experience your body and how we interact with one another. And it's going to be a place for experimentation. There are leftist board gamers who, they're creating these sort of experimental games that are about like going on strike. And like, that's the same sort of thing. We're creating an imaginary space in which you can experiment with different things. And whether that's, I talk about, I used to run like radical mindfulness groups where we would basically do secular sort of semi-Buddhist kind of meditation. But then instead of like Buddhist metaphysics, we'd be doing Marxist dialectical materialism. We'd be talking about like process and relation, and like then linking that into sort of like critiques of capitalism when we were chatting in between sessions. And so, yeah, I think there's such an intense spaces that we don't often talk about, just like on the left in general. Obviously, it's more likely to come up talking about ritual when on a Christian podcast, I'm sure, but on the left in general, these kind of like moments they don't really often come into conversations. And yet I think they are some of the spaces where there is a lot of potential for doing consciousness raising work.
There's something about, I don't think you should go to church to try and win people to leftism, right? I think that's a helpful thing. But I think there's something important there about, these being spaces that conjure up new possibilities, new realities. They're kind of separated from the world in some sense, that actually there is a potential receptiveness to some leftist ideas built in that, right? We want to create a new world, and actually if the rituals of your religious expression are about creating these kind of small spaces in which you can imagine a new world, a new way of relating, all this sort of stuff, then those are not inherently leftist spaces. Historically, they certainly have not been leftist spaces, but there's space there that being a leftist makes sense. It's not the only thing that makes sense, but there's a compatibility there that I think is potentially productive to inhabit.
Yeah, and I guess this sort of conversation kind of goes into a little bit of what I talk about in terms of strategy, not just in the context of religious groups, but on the left in general. Often there's a tendency to sort of talk about, well, what is the right way to engage with X? Should we be engaging with them directly? Should we be pulling away and doing our own thing? And my sort of view is, again, a sort of a pluralism, but a pluralism which is able to then work together to a common goal. So I personally would never go to church to try and like, I've forgotten the term, but
spread the revolution.
Well, yeah, that's what that's what I'm getting at. But there's entryism. I would never sort of advocate like church entryism myself, because I would fail at it.
I'm feeling quite judged here, to be honest.
but at the same time, I think that if someone does feel able to do that, that might actually be useful. And so I think there's a tendency on the left to go, oh, don't do that, do this. And I'm sort of like, well, there is use in entering into traditional institutions, whether they're religious or political and so on, and trying to find moments of leverage. It's useful to do that and to also create spaces outside of traditional institutions, even if it's like a Christian socialist podcast, to do those sort of things, though they both have a role to play and they can both sort of interact. And I think it is important to create spaces where you can just sort of relax and be like, I'm not having to go into battle with my neighbor today. I can just sort of chill out with people I know are, we have the same thing, and we can build a bigger sort of community that way. But I think it's also important to sometimes, at least for some people on the left, to when they have the energy to go like right head first into the most conflictual kind of relationships they can, because sometimes you can, if you go about it the right way, you can sort of build inside of institutions as well.
A lot of the time, though, whilst I sort of joke about going in and trying to take these kind of things head on, for me, I have to recognise that, yes, I am a socialist, but I'm also a Christian, and those two things, to some people, there's a conflict there, but actually it's not necessarily that I'm going into one like this space or that space with this other hat sneakily put on. Like, those things interact within me. They are part of who I am, part of my being. And a lot of those things, a lot of those conversations and different opportunities and ways of doing things are going to sort of arise organically just by being in that space, in a space that you have every right to be in because you are that, but you're also this.
Yeah, and in the book, for anyone else who listening who hasn't read it, I mean, there's so much to cover in the book that I can't spend a long amount of time on any subject. It's flipping from one thing to another. But I do spend a little bit of time talking about the sort of like typical leftist readings of certain passages in the Bible. If nothing else, just to convince atheist leftists that there is something to that argument, that one's socialism and one's Christianity, they can come from exactly the same place. But also, hopefully, like trying to convince maybe if a Christian who isn't a socialist happens to pick up the book as well, out of morbid curiosity, maybe I can sort of, nudge them in the same direction too.
The thing else I wanted to touch on briefly was you talk about love as a guiding ethic, loving relations. On one level, that's a really Christian, not exclusively, but a very Christian idea, but one that I think can lead to some really bad places, The old joke about love thy neighbour as thyself. Well, I don't want to be gay, so they shouldn't be either, sort of forms of Christianity, right? Like, we're loving people because we love them too much to stay in sin. And actually more liberal, but still quite patronising, well, I want to love the poor by being nice to them or donating to charity. And, those things are fine and good, but they're not actually empowerment of people. They're not actually support of people. I think it's really interesting, love is a very complicated idea and term, and it's perhaps easier to talk about having love as a guiding ethic than really to set out what that means. But it feels a very Christian thing to talk about. It's very Christian language, or very Christian compatible language, perhaps. But you kind of take it and kind of build in some of that, I guess, kind of that epistemological relativism you've talked about into that, to talk about loving people, kind of almost appreciating them as the person they are. So I thought it was a really interesting take on that kind of love-based ethic.
Yeah, as I can't remember any exact quotes, but I think I talk about sort of like the affirmation of the complexity of the other and the affirmation of the unknowability of the other and things like this. And obviously it can't simply remain on an individual level of the feeling of love for another. I think that is an important aspect. It does need to be constantly referred back to these wider scale sort of social critiques that we have. Those two have to be sort of like constantly interacting with one another. But when you're doing that, I think affirming complexity and unknowability to some extent helps to ward off the more reactionary uses of love, where that kind of love, I love you even though, you're gay, and I love you so much I want you not to be gay. That is very much the opposite, as I see it, in terms of that requires a reduction of the other and a sort of a creating into a sort of a two-dimensional kind of a caricature of the other, and one which you can only either accept or not accept, that is defined by a certain characteristic. There are very many ways in which it requires a sort of a reduction of the other. And by affirming complexity as a baseline, which is not to say that you accept anything that comes within that complexity, because then we have to refer it back to, sort of the more anti-fascist kind of arguments I'm making in the book. There's also that aspect of like, well, are the beliefs and actions of that other, are they contributing to, disempowerment of others and so on? So a politics based on love, like I say, if it's only based within the individual, it very quickly falls into those kind of dangers that you're talking about. I was careful to sort of like establish an anti-capitalist critique before I spent too much time talking about love, because if you start there, then you're not necessarily going to get to the anti-capitalist critique. But I think the two actually, when you approach them in the right way, they can actually work really nicely together. And I think it helps to respond to certain problems on the left. And I don't want to make the sort of argument, oh, atheists don't know how to love people and they have no ethics, blah, blah, blah. I'm not sort of saying that kind of thing. But I think the left does fall down sometimes on certain things that they can learn from religion, or from religious sort of perspectives on things like love, at least sort of religious leftists.
One of the things I'm always concerned about is that Christians often have a habit of equating respectability with love, as if they're the same thing. And I think the fact that you've sort of built that anti-capitalist and anti-fascist critique in early, hopefully does a lot of work to avoid some of that. You can't call someone out for doing something awful or saying something awful because we need to be respectful of each other.
You flipped the moneylenders' tables.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think it probably comes back to the kind of ontological realism aspect, right? Where we can see the impact certain views, certain actions have, right? We're able to see in the shared world that we all accept that, for example, even the kindest forms of homophobic theology have demonstrably negative impacts on queer people. So actually, yeah, you're doing that thing again of saying, yeah, people are coming from different places and we want to respect that diversity, but also recognize that there is a shared world and we have impacts on the world that we all agree to be real, and we can judge what is an acceptable and not acceptable position, viewpoint, worldview to have based on the impact it has on the real world. So whether or not you believe in the Trinity maybe isn't going to have a direct impact on the world that exists, right? But actually kind of homophobic theologies, pro-capitalist Christian arguments, they do have real impacts on the real world. And therefore we can say, well, if love is our guiding ethic, it is not loving to say and do and support things that negatively impacts the people that share this world we're in.
Yeah, exactly. And that sort of just reminded me, I guess when you were talking about before, this idea of art criticism versus biblical sort of interpretation, like someone's view of the Trinity. Something I tried to stress in the book is that it's neither the case that someone's theology or just their philosophy in general, it's not that absolutely determines someone's behavior, which is what I think a lot of atheist leftists imagine. They imagine there is a single thing called Christianity. It has no complexity, has no internal conflicts. It's just a single thing. And that absolutely determines people's behavior. And of course, the behaviors that they see are the most outrageous ones. So they assume that that's a natural outgrowth of all forms of Christianity and therefore it must be opposed. Whereas what I'm trying to argue is not that. It's clearly not that. It's demonstrably not that. You wouldn't have Christo-fascists and Christian leftists if that was the case. It's just empirically nonsense. But it's also not the case that it's just a complete free-for-all and that it has no impact on how people behave. It's more that it creates certain, almost like a space, and then within that space, it's not necessarily play, but it's more that there are different ways of sort of interpreting the complexity of things within that. You have in the Bible this huge kind of multiplicity of different sort of symbols, and they can be brought together in different ways by different people. So it still matters that people are reading the Bible as opposed to some other text. It still matters that people have different theological kind of opinions. But it's neither absolutely determining nor completely irrelevant. It's a thing that you personally interpret, but also, as you're saying, importantly, you enter into a community that then stabilizes interpretations. And that's one reason why I think it's quite important for atheist leftists to support, even if I can't convince them to actually talk to Christians, at the very least support the existence and the growth of Christian leftist communities, because it can help to stabilize interpretations of not just the Bible, but of biblical texts. And that can be the basis of people then actually sort of creating organizations and taking action and sort of living in a way in which, as we were talking about, their Christianity and their leftism are just part and parcel of the same worldview.
I do sort of think that the sort of new atheist era of atheism, the Dawkins and Sam Harris, all this lot. I actually think that it's been, in the long term, pretty good for Christianity, actually. Because, yes, there are always atheists on the left, and some of those atheists are, loud. But my overwhelming experience as someone who has lived and worked and so on in quite a lot of different left-wing spaces now is that most people on the left these days, I think it was very different in the past, but these days are far less aggressive and ready to go at you when you say you're Christian or Muslim or whatever it is. I was at an anarchist meeting not too long ago, and a young hijabi Muslim woman came in, and it was her first time, and she was welcomed, and there was absolutely no sense that she shouldn't be there. And I don't know if that would have happened 20, 30 years ago.
I think there's a levelling effect, isn't there, in terms of with that new atheist stuff. There's kind of we can go, okay, atheists, we have our annoying reactionary dickheads. You have your annoying reactionary dickheads.
Yeah.
We're all struggling against the people who share that same viewpoint as us, but are being awful about it. There's kind of a recognition that actually atheism is not inherently morally superior, that you can still go in pretty awful directions with it, much as you can with any spirituality.
And I think when you do still see people being that reactive on the left, it tends to be online, and it does tend to be older people, which is not to say I haven't come across younger leftists who are not great on it, but I think you're right that the trajectory is in our favour. But yeah, the new atheist, I don't think I mentioned it in the book, but I'm pretty sure that was actually when I stopped using the term atheist to describe myself, because it just took on. It was just I didn't want to be a sort of a slow dawning realization. It feels like quite a long time ago now. Would it have been like 20 years ago? But anyway, sort of at first being like, oh yeah, finally people were talking about all this stuff, because like I was saying, at the time I was in my stage of reacting against religion, and I was like, I was an atheist. It's like, oh, finally people are talking about this, and then just very sort of slowly going, you're not, not exactly how I would put it. And I was like, no, I'm a secular thinker now. I'm not an atheist, because it just became such a toxic, horrible kind of thing. And
secular thinker is the atheist equivalent of saying, I'm not a Christian, but I'm a follower of Jesus. It's please don't associate me with those a lot. Yeah,
it's the equivalent of spiritual but not religious.
Yes.
So I think there's a kind of parallel here as well between, how young people deal with the internet. Not all young people, because obviously a lot of very young men are influenced by people like Andrew Tate, and young women not so much. But between that and you look at how older generations deal with the internet, and you find that now there are a lot of older people who are becoming radicalized on the right and really influenced by conspiracy theories and all this kind of thing. And I think there's something about the sort of younger generation that can kind of spot a lot of the signs of this kind of stuff in a similar way to how they spotted a lot of the signs of how people like Richard Dawkins weren't just selling you atheism. Right? They could see some of the underlying ideological stuff that was going on there and didn't want anything to do with it.
I think that is probably just about all we have time for today. It's been really fascinating. I thoroughly recommend the book Red Enlightenment. It is available from Repeater Books. You can go on their website and you can get an ebook and a physical book. And you should do that rather than go on Amazon like you're going to be tempted to. But yeah, thoroughly recommended. We haven't touched on a great deal of it today because there's loads in there. And yeah, something very worth delving into. And yeah, get hold of it from Repeater or from a nice local leftist independent bookshop if you've got one. Graham, thank you very much for joining us today. If people want to kind of hear more from you, is there any way that they can do so?
Thank you very much for having me on. It was great. I'm online, but I don't really post anything very interesting. I'm on Twitter as On a Life Glug. I mainly just post bad jokes and then retweet other people. If you want to remind yourself that the book exists, add me on there.
Brilliant. Adam, where in the world can people find you?
You can find me most places at Commie, Xian.
Fantastic. You can get in touch with us. All our contact details are on breadandrosaries.com. We've got all the social medias. We've got email addresses. You can actually send us a text now, which is a strange thing that you can do.
I do want to encourage people to use that as well. If you go in the show notes and click the thing that says send us a text, like that's a really quick way of letting us know what you think or asking us a question, and we will read them. So do that.
I thought originally that it would like redirect to Adam's number, so I clicked on it and sent a "Hey Sexy" message to it, and then found out that it just drops in the email inbox that we share, which was less exciting.
And also doesn't tell you who it comes from either.
Yeah, that's what I thought was good about
got
it.
a random message saying "Hey Sexy," and I'm like, okay, that's not creepy.
But yeah, please do get in touch. We'd like to hear back from people, thoughts, feedback, questions, suggestions, all that sort of thing. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Graham. And we will see you all next time. Goodbye.
See you later.
Bye.